Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first Movers and Shakers event in this series of 3, Building Back to Business in the Midlands. Today's focus will be on Coventry and Warwickshire, and my name is Simon Montgomery, and I'm the Regional Director of Movers and Shakers. For those of you who don't know, Movers and Shakers have been running first-class property events for the last 25 years, bringing together key players in the private and public sector. And the Movers and Shakers big initiative for 2021 is to drive more and better public and private sector collaboration, locally and indeed globally. And that is something I feel we have done in abundance today. But firstly, before I move on to the session, a big thank you to our sponsors today, Avison Young, who are experts in creating real economic, social and environmental value to the real estate marketplace. Their success is powered by the people on the ground. They obviously have an international reach, but more importantly, they have a fabulous team here in the Midlands, with reference today, more importantly, Coventry and Warwickshire, working with large and small clients alike, work on a wide range of topics, delivering some excellent results. We have a wonderful relationship with the team on the ground here in the Midlands, and indeed, we are partnering with them for the remainder of this series of 3, and we thank them very much for their support. Today, the first session, the City Focus, Investing in Coventry and Warwickshire, Building Back to Business. The webinar today will delve into the biggest challenges and major opportunities in Coventry and Warwickshire. And we have assembled a first-class panel of private and public sector leaders on what is happening in the region, the big opportunities for investment, overcoming the pandemic and building back to business, with a big focus indeed on inward investments for the city and surrounds. The contributors today are Martin Reeves, who is the Chief Executive of Coventry City Council, Sarah Windram, who's the CEO of the Emerald Group and also the Chair of the Coventry and Warwickshire LEP. Neil Edgington is the Managing Director of EDG Property. Richard Mees is the Managing Director of Rainier Developments. Monica Fogarty is the Chief Executive of Warwickshire County Council. And our Chair today is Carl Potter, and Carl is the Principal and Managing Director of Avison Young in Birmingham. A very quick overview of the session today. Carl will kick things off with an Avison Young overview of the region, which will be followed by Martin. Martin will deliver a keynote about Coventry and the opportunities that exist moving forward within the city. That will be followed by a Q&A with between Carl and Martin, which should be fascinating. And then we'll move on into a panel session with all the panelists I've just referred to. In total, that should last for about an hour and 15 minutes. Please don't forget, there is the opportunity to ask questions. So if you are watching through the platform, there is a questions tab on the right-hand side of the screen. And Carl will field those questions and do his best to integrate those into the panel session today. So please do get involved with the session today. It does add a lot of value. I think that's enough from me. Thank you very much for attending. Without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Carl, who will kickstart with his overview of the region. Carl, over to you, and thank you.
Simon, thank you very much for that introduction. As Simon said, I'm Carl Potter. I'm the Managing Director of Avison Young here in our Birmingham office in the Midlands. And this is the first of 3 webinars that we're sponsoring, concentrating on the West Midlands key cities, Wolverhampton, Birmingham, and today, of course, we're concentrating, as Simon says, on Coventry and also the linkages across the wider Warwickshire area that provide the region with a quite compelling growth story based upon solid and far-sighted economic principles. I think to a large extent, with culture now recognised as being at the heart of a thriving city, the success of Coventry's status as UK City of Culture 2021 was set to throw limelight onto what has become a vastly improved city and city centre offering. The city has the huge benefit of 2 enormously well-regarded but very different universities that work dynamically and symbiotically to provide a workforce that fuels the city's key industries. From the world-class National Automotive Innovation Centre, underpinned by Tata Automotive and Warwickshire University, to the world-renowned Automotive Design Centre of Excellence at Coventry University, the city really is at the forefront of technology changes as the world moves away from the internal combustion engine. And we'll also hear today from Monica about the role that Warwickshire plays in that wider offering. Coventry is already home to the UK's only dedicated electrical vehicle factory, the Geely owned LEVC, and that's recently increased its range beyond the iconic London taxi to production of electric vans. But it's not just that, nor JLR, that are important to the region. It's the significant supply chain, the multiple SMEs, and the innovation and entrepreneurial growth that the city enjoys that really fuels its economy. And I think with that background, it was inevitable that Coventry would become home to the UK's battery industrialisation centre. Now completed and fully established, it's going to be joined by a proposal virtually adjacent to JLR's Whitley Design and Engineering Centre to redevelop the former Coventry Airport site as a 3.5 million square feet gigafactory, one of 6 needed to ensure that the UK's automotive industry meets its target of decarbonising by 2030. And this proposal, a joint venture between Coventry City Council and Rigby Estates, has the full backing of the West Midlands Combined Authority, the Mayor, Andy Street, and will be the subject of a planning application very shortly. I'll be talking more to Martin about that during this conversation. If the double economic whammy of Brexit and the pandemic have told us anything, it's clear that strong tech clusters, whether life sciences or battery storage technologies, are going to fuel economic growth immediately post-COVID. Coventry really is well prepped to take advantage. As outlined by Simon this morning, I have the pleasure of being joined firstly by Martin Reeves, Chief Executive of Coventry City Council, who will outline his views and visions. Following that, we'll have a Q&A session. Martin will join a panel of eminent speakers for that panel session, during which we will be delighted to take questions from yourselves as the audience. Please, as Simon says, use the Q&A tab. That will come later, but firstly, Martin Reeves, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for your generous support of this, and a really good context actually in terms of where we are in Coventry and the wider Coventry and Warwickshire area. So also, if I don't get a chance later, massive thanks to colleagues and friends who have agreed to be on this panel from very different sectors. It's promising to be a good debate later. Well, what I wanted to do, and there'll just be some slides, colleagues, just rolling behind of some photographs and imagery of the city. I don't intend to do death by PowerPoint. I just wanted to quickly rattle through almost a 10-point plan of where I think Coventry has found itself, some of the challenges and opportunities going forward with regards to inward investment, development, and a kind of an ongoing economic renaissance. So bear with me as I go through these 10 points, and I'll do it quickly. And you can, if you get bored of looking at my face, you can look at some very pretty pictures of how our city has been physically transformed over the last few years. So point number 1, this started a long time ago with a compelling, coherent economic narrative for Coventry, which immediately became obvious that the assets, many of which were hidden in Coventry when I arrived 12 or so years ago, was inextricably linked to our partners across in Warwickshire. So the powerful narrative of Coventry and Warwickshire has grown and become more compelling over the last decade and a half, and so it should be. But I wanted to start there. This has not been something which has been through serendipity. It's been a clearly linked story about what our assets are and how we should be shouting much more loudly to audiences, both national and international, and also to understand the power of Coventry is only understood by the power of those around us, including Warwickshire, Birmingham, other cities and towns of the West Midlands, and particularly also the power of still our only global city in London. But secondly, and point number 2, that our economic regeneration determination within that overall story has been a really, in my view, quite a bold, compelling vision over that decade and a half as well. And I have to say, genuinely backed by very consistent, very strong, very bold political leadership. And that is critical, as all of you know, as investors, developers, agents in this context. You must have that boldness and that consistent support of a strategy for change, because we know it will take significant amount of time. Thirdly, though, we needed to have a very, very clear strategy. So as well as the story, the regeneration kind of vision, as compelling as it was, we needed a clear strategy. And that was based on a really clear sense that our city centre, starting from the old medieval crossroads at Broadgate, and the ability for us to lock in rather than out development opportunities within the ring road to the opportunities across the city, which is only 6.5, 7 miles to city limits, and then out with to our Warwickshire colleagues and around the wider region, required a clear strategy. And again, we knew that this needed to gain momentum. And as I'll talk about later, a significant amount of that was not seen for some time. And that strategy was deliberative as we thought about what needed to go in the ground with regards to fibre infrastructure, for example, but also what needed to be that enabling infrastructure, often not grabbing the headlines, in order to strategically move forward with some of those investment opportunities. And people on this call will be the judges of whether that worked quickly enough or not, but that was certainly a clear strategy, which was supported, of course, by not just core city council funding, but significant external funding, which was very cleverly matched, melded with our own to really deliver that kind of strategic approach. Which links to my fourth point around Coventry has seen, again, within those first 3 points, a significant, arguably massive, and certainly in our history, unrivaled levels of investment. And that has been, again, focused particularly on capital build. We still sit with somewhere in the region of a 200, 250 million pound annual capital programme, much of it to stimulate the kind of economic regeneration that I've referred to in our vision. But actually, if you think about what's happened, and some of these photographs and imagery shows it, really significant multi-million pounds spent on improvements of design quality, materials, public realm, the ability to understand it's not just the buildings that we need to invest in, it's actually the spaces in between. Think about what's happened around the railway station and some of the quality of the deck across interconnecting into our city centre. And the fibre I've referred to already, the renewable system of thinking about how we can plug in not just future digital connectivity, but also making sure that our energy systems for our private sector, public sector, community sector agents and tenants are actually set for the future and future-proofed as far as possible. That has been really quite significant, and it's seen now above surface as well, major physical transformation to our city. It is unrecognisable from that of a decade ago, and even unrecognisable from a few years ago. The other thing we've invested in heavily, which will absolutely be seen to come into its own as we go through the 2021 and 2022 years in a national international stage, is actually our tourism assets, our infrastructure, and we'll start to see, in my view, in Coventry and across to Warwickshire and the region, a marked change in what we see and are viewed as by visitors, as well as, of course, of our potential inward investors who want to have a very coherent view of the city and understand what the assets are in one place. So if that was the fourth bit around massive investment, let's just think a little bit about those kind of incredible, what I call enabling symbols and emblems of change. And Carl's already kindly sort of referred to the fact that we are in the national, in fact, international spotlight now, having started our UK City of Culture with our Coventry Move signature event, seen across 67 different countries around the globe, and to have gone viral, an opportunity for that spotlight and showcase, but then linked into the main host along with Birmingham for the for the Commonwealth Games, alongside handover from UK City of Culture, and the amazing footprint that Warwickshire colleagues have got as well for Commonwealth Games, provides emblems, symbols of confidence as we come out of this pandemic and think about priming the preconditions for a recovery, or more that I'm going to refer to at the end, a reset and a reimagination of what our towns and cities should really look like. Now, these are really important. They don't make change on their own, but they do provide a very different narrative for investment, for people that have already invested in our city, or those that have maybe never had a footprint before in our city, in our region. And these should not be underestimated, but they have to go hand in hand with an enabling local authority environment, removing the obstacles to growth and development, and also to make sure that the funding and the innovation is there rather than just a compelling vision for change. It's not a surprise, therefore, that I go right back to point one around our narrative, that winning UK City of Culture, Commonwealth Games, Rugby League World Cup, and so on, was not done by accident. It was a core part of our narrative and our strategy to become event central and to lead ourselves, along with Warwickshire, as a national and international event central. And people joked about that at the beginning and felt we didn't have the asset base. We've built it, we've grown it, and like investment, it just feeds itself. We are now the go-to place for hallmark events, and that will be big as we come out of the pandemic. So sixth, and don't want to spend too much time on this because there's prospectuses out there. Many of this call will know about the opportunities that exist within Coventry within that context that I've outlined. But the sixth point here is around the fact that we have, through Friargate, as we see, not just the ongoing footplate around the £80 million reimagination. It really is not refurbished, it's a reimagination of the railway station as part of the master plan. Friargate 2 coming out of the ground now. New hotel going in and getting that away, a continued improvement of that whole connectivity of Friargate into our city centre. Belgrade Plaza, that whole area around Belgrade. You saw some great photographs of our newest hotel at the Telegraph. Great upgrades to Belgrade Theatre itself. And Neil will talk about, I'm sure, an opportunity for his amazing development across the way, but never really having connected, if I'm honest, that part of our city across into the main core of the city centre. And we're now doing that, using culture, using art, and using public realm in a much more sensitive way. And of course, the huge potential for us to reimagine, as we did in the 1950s, our city centre, and for our city centre scheme with SPG going out now through a prospectus to really think about further investment and funding partners. Actually, how you learn from what's happened in the economy, learn from what's happened in the pandemic to reimagine a city centre of the future will not be based on retail, but we're based on activation, animation, living, and again, the spaces between buildings rather than just the buildings themselves. And number 7, and I'll get through so we can get into some Q&A, Carl. Number 7, look, you mentioned this brilliantly as part of a context. In at the same time, what we're seeing is a city like Coventry having to remind itself about the assets, the sectors that is traditionally, historically got a compelling proposition because it's strong with our universities, our R&D sector. So actually those new technologies you referred to, new electrification ecosystem. Yes, the gigafactory is incredibly important, as is the continued grounding out of the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre and the work up at WMG and our amazing supply chain. But actually, there's so much more we need to do about future mobility, the nexus between digital, green, future mobility, and how people will work in the future. Which leads me to point number 8, which I know I've had a number of conversations with. Roll those pictures back around again if you're able to, Shiz, that'd be great, rather than people looking at my business card. Don't worry if you can't. But point A about the pandemic and what was happened, and we've had a number of conversations on with people on this call over the last 18 months. Just quickly, from an economic perspective and from a city and a region perspective, we have seen dramatic changes to the way in which people work, the way in which supply chains work, the way in which digital collaboration works. We have seen major travel changes to modes of how people move around. We have seen in Coventry and Warwickshire and the entire West Midlands, a complete rewriting in real time of economic geography. Question, how much of those changing trends, including city-based office accommodation and work patterns, are fleeting as a result of the dramatic impact of the pandemic and the fact this has affected everyone globally, and how much of that is literally enduring, hardwired in to the way in which we need to think about inward investment, work with new sectors, existing sectors in the future. And I'm not clever enough to be able to predict all of that. My sense is we'll end up with some changes that will never be reversed. But we'll see others maybe that will inexorably go back to where they were pre-pandemic. What we have to do is remain absolutely firm and fast on the assets and the foundations that have stood us in good stead as a city, as I say, over the last decade and a half. You do not magic up new sectors overnight. Trust me, there's too many other cities up and down the UK who are moving themselves into areas where they simply do not have the supply chain, the R&D skill, the funding and the investment history to be able to do it, but they know there is a desperate need to expand and diversify their economy. That's dangerous. You need to have the core strengths. and I believe Coventry has got it in those new technologies. Penultimately then, nine, what do I think about the investment and funding models? And I spend a lot of time alongside my day job talking to Treasury about how we fund differently cities and regions for the future on economic growth. And the truth about this is levelling up, Community Recovery Fund, and the forerunners of what a UK shared prosperity fund could look like for Coventry and the region, we miss out. And I'm not going to make any political comments, but economically, both Coventry and Warwickshire are not prioritised within levelling up and within the Community Recovery Fund. So therefore, we need to find new and novel ways of locking in new investment, our own covenants, our own long-term securitisation, to be able to think differently about how we can make all of this kind of stuff the norm as we deliver higher design threshold, as we create new opportunities for our cities and our county. And actually, that's going to require very, very different views of investors and developers and government on Green Book. Think about the investment into green infrastructure for the future in cities like Coventry and regions like Coventry and Warwickshire. That requires a fundamentally different mindset on investment and return. So we need to really hold our nerve on this and be disruptive at the same time that local government per se is continuing to see a diminution of revenue and capacity. And this is capitalised. So most of the levelling up, even if you can access it, is on capitalisation, capital projects in the main. Great, we need more of those, but we need more social capital. We need more ability to be able to link people in to those job opportunities and skills challenges of the future. Which leads me finally to my final point, Carl, and then I'll shut up and we'll get into a Q&A, which will be far more interesting. What's facing Coventry, Warwickshire, and I would argue the entire Midlands coming out of the pandemic, because we have been hit arguably harder than many other parts of the UK, but we can bounce back even quicker, is that none of us here should talk about recovery. What we should really talk about together is the fact that we must reset and reimagine a very different kind of economic future, much more sustainable, much greener, much more inclusive, much more prosperous, actually, for Coventry and Warwickshire. And that means that we have to try harder than even we did coming into the pandemic. And it needs to be different. And I would urge all of you to think very differently about your own business models. And whilst it's not the answer to everything, I've been impressed to see, for example, L&G thinking about their link up with Professor Michael Marmot from UCL about their world and thinking about health inequalities and how they can think differently and support some of the research. And we are the only Marmot city. And Monica and colleagues in Warwickshire have been really supportive of our approach to improve people's health outcomes. Guess how they improve them? By access to jobs, by access to the kind of amazing homes and regeneration potential that comes through all of these kinds of schemes now and in the future. But we need to make this happen. It won't happen by accident. So the future looks very bright, but it must be a reimagined future, Carl and colleagues, maybe from that one that we've been used to in Coventry and Warwickshire over the last decade and a half that I've known it. Thanks very much.
Martin, thank you very much for that. And for outlining the very strategic approach that the city has taken over a long period of time to get itself to where it is. And as you say, it's no coincidence that you've ended up where you are. You've talked about the City of Culture 2021, and obviously the longer exposure that the Commonwealth Games within the region brings to Coventry and Warwickshire itself. That's really put Coventry in the spotlight. And both nationally and internationally, with a lot of Commonwealth countries being places where capital is being deployed around the world, places like Malaysia, Singapore, Canada, Australia, etc. It's very important the region gets great exposure to those. So you've had some really impressive regeneration schemes, but in particular, you talked about Friargate, the station, and that interrelationship, and the hard work that you put into placemaking to get that digital infrastructure being in place. And you talk more now about getting green infrastructure and social capital. So what is next for Friargate and how important is that to you? It seems to be gathering momentum. So you've got the second office building under construction. You talk about the new hotel. Where's it going to next? It's an enormously interesting scheme, probably better placed geographically, locationally within the sort of the micro part of the city, next door to the station, huge public realm leading straight into the retail core. Where are you going with Friargate next?
Thanks, Carl. I think Friargate is a very, very good example. Again, everyone on this call will know the patience required to deliver out a scheme of that size and initial complexity. When I arrived, interestingly, my view around this narrative that I mentioned, Carl, was that I believe that Coventry, through the stimulation of major schemes like Friargate, had something like 25 years, 2.5 decades in front of it to deliver out all of those keynote and keystone type developments and regeneration, of which Friargate was a key one. So if you then fast forward the 12.5 years I've been in Coventry from that point, we are halfway through what is required. I just wanted to say that because that shows what is required for consistent partnership support, political leadership, but also patience of investors, funders, partners and others. So in terms of where next, we've already talked about the next key elements. For me, there's then a really important point about holding our nerve around HS2, regularity of services along that railway network, because that's really important for us. The move towards residential, because we want to understand the notion of new living and thinking about living as a mix alongside that office, the railway interchange as well. So not just Friargate 2, which will be challenged and challenging as we think about office space being used very differently. My point about are the changes about home working, collaborative working, Carl, are they enduring or are they fleeting? So we need to think differently about the floor plates, about how we use amenity space within the building and around it. But that will go up, and that's really exciting and really high designed, high quality offering in the hotel. And before you know it, the master plan starts to feel even more real as we've done all those hard yards. And then you're able to really imagine the vision of living and urban living in and around that. And above all, and this is the point, connecting that. And it was always the biggest challenge I had and the biggest criticism I have of Coventry was this lack of connectivity between schemes. And if you know what planners call the legibility and the ability to really tell that story. So then to continue to flow through from a much more burgeoning Friargate into the city centre south scheme, and why the wave was so important to tell a story of a £40 million water park experience as you enter then into the main scheme of city centre south. So yeah, lots to do. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, and more patience will be required. And I suppose the final bit I'll say on that, people forget very quickly, and I know I keep saying it, how horrendous that was around the railway station, and just the kind of image it gave of walking into what it felt like a dormitory town rather than a burgeoning global city. And we're not there yet, but we've made major strides forward.
Thanks for that, Martin. Infrastructure has always been enormously important. I think in the future, the types of infrastructure are going to be looked at really differently. And as you say, we shouldn't be talking about recovery. Yeah, we might want to talk about bounce back, but as you say, we need to reset and reimagine. So what does that look like to you?
You brilliantly contextualised at the beginning. Again, just framing this, look, we need to do more. Even Coventry, which ranks, quite frankly, last time I looked, and Sarah Windrum might tell me I'm wrong on this, but last time I looked on the digital tables, we're now third in terms of fibre connectivity, including into the home, having already fibred up the city core. We need to work even harder on 5G. And linking in that fibre connectivity to make sure that there is true accessibility both on devices, but also the bandwidth quality for businesses, residents, particularly in the social housing, dense housing areas. That's a big work. And I'm saying that from a city that literally is third in the country on fibre connectivity and has got an incredible reputation of challenging the market on telecommunications and digital. So lots more to do on there. On green infrastructure for the future, we are putting our toe in the water. Where are our real senses of real scale global energy provision that is absolutely going to reduce cost to serve of businesses, but also of domestic households that are still facing fuel poverty in Coventry and the West Midlands higher than many other parts of the country. So we dipped our toe, but where are we on that linked to local methods of energy production and infrastructure? I'm embarrassed, as everyone on this call should be, that in a country that's got a GDP output as challenging as it has been in the UK over the pandemic and coming into it, that we are still having conversations with big businesses and supply chain about providing affordable power into sites. That's embarrassing that we're having that conversation about not being able to unlock sites for the future. And of course, then your point around the infrastructure on end-to-end electrification. I know everyone's getting excited about Gigafactory. I'm excited about a Gigafactory, batteries of the future, but the real gig here is the end-to-end, from the point of understanding the sourcing right the way through to future mobility, middle space, right the way through to end-of-life battery use and recirculation. And so all of those things. But the final bit I'll finish with, because no one ever wants to talk about it enough, is my point about reimagination. Is that's all really important, and we need more of it, and we need to try hard, and the investment will be different. There'll be people thinking, but that's not the model, because the payback will be long term, might not come at all in the way we've been used to. I get that. But we've got to try harder on the social infrastructure you referred to. Is not social value ticking a box for our businesses and for the local authorities and for our anchor institutions? Right? We stand up and say enough is enough. We've got to lock in local supply, local produce, because that's green and it's right for the economy. We've got to start connecting our young lost generation through this pandemic and our 50, 55 pluses who have been, if we're not careful, chucked on the scrap heap in the same way they were in the 1980s, to reimagine and re-skill and re-confidence those cohorts in a way that gives opportunities back as we grow. Now, I can do a certain amount in the City Council and insist on certain things, planning, licensing, obligations around procurement, but I need business, small, large, and extra large in the city and region, and also investors to think very differently, well beyond normal corporate social responsibility, because it's good for business and it's good for a much more inclusive city. But I'm fed up with people just talking about it. This needs to be hardwired and actioned into our regeneration plans. If otherwise, it will end up looking like a bunch of shiny buildings, looking beautiful, with lots of opportunities from those that have always gained in the past. That's not what we're up for in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. You talked earlier, and I'm going to come back to this during the panel session, about the use of offices and how we've changed that during the pandemic, and whether that's fleeting or long lasting. So we're going to look at some of the trends there. But my guess is that Coventry, as a city that has so much more to offer from a job perspective, is going to be less damaged than other cities as a consequence of that. But we'll pick that up later. Now I'm just about ready to move into the panel Q&A. So Shalise, if we can get the panel up on the screen, please. We're going to start with Monica. Monica does know that the first question is coming to her, so hopefully Monica Fogarty, most of you will know, is Chief Exec of Warwickshire County Council, and Warwickshire works synonymously, as Martin says, with Coventry itself. And I talked earlier about the two major universities in the area that work really well together, Coventry University, Warwick University, and they take diverse undergraduates through world-class courses, and the synergy between the two is amazing when you look at it in the context of the economy of the area. So how can Warwickshire capitalise on the region's huge investment, Monica, in transport, technology and skills? And what are the key challenges and opportunities within the region's automotive industry?
Thanks, Carl. Thanks for that question. And good morning, everyone. Lovely to be here. If I can just go a bit broad in the first instance and sort of reflect back on the pandemic. So going into the pandemic, there was a pipeline of commercial property recently delivered and under construction of over £1 billion worth. And all of that was focused on transport technology, R&D. And we've seen that interest continue. So you look at things like Myra Tech Park, for example, and in recent months, Re Automotive, the Israeli auto tech company, British Volt, they've announced new R&D HQ sites just north of Nuneaton. So that's all continuing. And last week, of course, Myra announced a JV with Evans Randall to bring forward development of a new manufacturing site in North Warwickshire. And then in the south, very strong connection with the University of Warwick, the development of the Wellesbourne Innovation Campus, a university site in Stratford district. Now, the opportunities for these businesses is the access here to the right talent, both from the universities in terms of skills coming out of the universities, but also the existing supply chain, things like Anstey Tech Park, the Silicon Spa Games Cluster here in Leamington Spa, and the strong demand, the increasing demand that we've seen over the pandemic from e-commerce. There's so much private sector led activity here developed over many years, but also attracted in by the supply chain of talent and skills and opportunity. And Martin and yourself were talking about the change of use of space and our workplaces, which are irrevocably changed now following the pandemic. And so our amplified challenge here is to have the right space available. The industrial part of commercial property has remained strong throughout the pandemic, providing enough space and across the range of needs, from startup space for growing businesses, smaller, more affordable industrial units, and larger spaces for manufacturing. That is going to be key going forward. So such high demand for warehouse and logistics space is really impacting upon the space for other sectors. And back to the skills thing, raising awareness of the careers in this sector and inspiring our young people who have been so hard hit over the past couple of years, inspiring our young people to look at the business and employment opportunities. And the city of culture, Martin and I really strongly believe that the legacy of City of Culture will be about diverse, different, new challenges and opportunities for our young people. And that's what we've got a collective commitment to work on, really shaping those opportunities for the legacy of City of Culture. I mean, we see this in EV cars, for example. UK BIC, that's open now, not officially. Gigafactory, as Martin mentioned, the JV with Coventry City and the airport, and the automotive industry really having to bring forward different skills around things like green propulsion systems. So I would say that that crossover between creative, digital and automotive is something that we're really steeped in skills here in Coventry and Warwickshire, and that's going to really stand us in good stead going into the future around connected and autonomous vehicles and 5G, which in the West Midlands we're a pilot for. And what I would say is that the private sector, and some of you are so much further ahead on this than others, but the private commercial sector really needing to embrace change and innovation and reimagining, as Martin said, and explore those new partnerships and opportunities through working with us as local authorities. We're all on the same page. I think we've all got to get on the same pace now.
Thanks, Monica. That's really interesting. And when I turn to Neil in a few minutes, we'll start talking about how residential development may have changed as a consequence of the pandemic and what we've been seeing. But firstly, Sarah, congratulations on your recent appointment as chair of Coventry and Warwickshire NEP. You've heard both Martin and Monica talk about the very exciting times ahead for the transformational changes the UK, the world is going to face in terms of the automotive industry. From a LEP perspective, economic growth is key to your agenda. So what's your vision and what are the opportunities?
Thank you very much, Carl. And yeah, thank you for your congratulations. I took over as chair on the 1st of April. So yeah, interesting times, challenging times, but certainly very exciting times, as you've heard already this morning. So our reset framework that we produced at the end of last year as a response to the pandemic and EU exit, we very much wanted to be a reset, not a recovery, because I think you've heard from both Martin and Monica about this kind of reimagining of Coventry and Warwickshire, and we wanted to firmly be part of that. And so our reset framework has the objective of making Coventry and Warwickshire a highly attractive place to live, work and invest. And I would say my vision goes a bit further than that. I want Coventry and Warwickshire to be the place to live, work and invest. And I think we've got some really exciting opportunities as part of that. One of the areas of focus that I want to look at is scale-ups. I think we've seen a record number of startups through the pandemic. Not surprisingly, I started my own business in 2009 in the middle of a recession previously. I think that's always the case, isn't it? You see that kind of startup culture really spring to life. So how are we going to scale those businesses and how are we going to support those businesses to scale? And I think we've got great opportunities, particularly, as you've heard already, in net zero in the green economy, but also in health. New solutions, particularly tech-driven solutions in the health sector, We've got, innovation assets in that space, UHCW's Innovation Hub. We've got, as you've heard, the Games Cluster and Games Technologies are, amazing universities. I think we've got a real opportunity to be building the next generation products and services for the green economy, but also for the health economy as well. And you've heard from Martin about that kind of more creative approach to investment and new funds, and I think that's something I'm particularly looking at when we talk about scale-ups and how we can kind of support them in access to finance. I think that's a really exciting opportunity both for businesses but also for investors as well. The other area, again, you've heard from Martin about the work that's happened to Coventry City Centre. I think our high streets, our town centres, our city centre, as we move to what everyone's calling the experience age, there's real opportunity there in terms of rethinking community assets, destination venues, as you've heard. Personally, I quite like the idea of looking at our blue spaces. I rediscovered the Warwickshire canals during the pandemic. I did a lot of walking along the canals to kind of clear the head. And I think we've got some real opportunities there to think about blue space and how we incorporate our blue space. We're pretty far from the sea, but we've got great rivers and canals. I think all of that plays into kind of the future of well-being. You've heard as well from Martin about VLR and that kind of physical connectivity alongside the digital connectivity as well for our high streets. Future high streets, particularly looking at 5G and what that can do. So that's very exciting. And lastly, I think there's a huge opportunity around skills, around attracting new talent, but also around reskilling existing talent. And again, you've heard about workplaces of the future. What role is technology and games technology playing in learning? I was hearing yesterday about a platform that's going to help entrepreneurs to kind of understand their strengths and weaknesses. Essentially, it's a game. You're running a business as a game, but it's identifying where you might need to improve or where you might need to get support. And I think it's very interesting thinking about that and the kind of the role that the sort of games technology world has got to play in our future workplaces and our future skills development.
Thank you, Sarah. We will pick up on gaming a little bit later. I won't ask Martin Reeves to talk about games theory, but I'm sure he's quite capable of doing that. We're going to move over to Neil now. And Neil, turning to lessons learned from the pandemic, we've talked about the economic impacts and shifts in sector growth, which were probably also inevitable as we moved out of the EU. But the city's attracted some very interesting residential developments. Ironmonger's not your first, but has the pandemic changed what you might have otherwise done with the development?
Thanks, Carl, and good morning, everybody. It's a big question, isn't it? How's the pandemic kind of changed residential? As we've heard today, it's changed our lives in so many ways that perhaps if we rewind 2 years, we'd never have seen coming so quickly, certainly, from retail habits, from office home working, from the way we exercise and all the other things that we've heard about today. But I think the one lesson that we've all taken from the pandemic, whether we've been trying to kind of educate kids and do a day job and all of these things, is our home has become more than just a place where we go back to very late at night to rest our heads. It's become something that's much, much wider than that. And I think all residential developers will no doubt be looking at how they adapt to it. You alluded in your question, and Martin referenced also that we've done previous schemes in Coventry, and we've always tried to not follow a model. They've all been bespoke. All of our developments have been bespoke, A, for the location, B, for the environment we're working in, etc. And the cooperative, which we developed in Coventry City Centre, 63 units, was planned around an internal park. It was the first internal park in the region, a real live living park with, trees imported from Italy that were 40 years old and all this stuff, and 63 units that internally face overlooking this park, which was new, and it was all about creating an environment. And not only did that go really well, it set record capital values for Coventry, the highest capital values seen by city centre residential in Coventry. It set record rental levels, and still continues to do both of those today. So moving forward, what we try and do is learn from not only lessons that the pandemic has taught us all, but actually lessons we've learned on previous schemes. So on the back of the cooperative, we bought a building, as you say, on Ironmonger Row, or the Burgess, a dilapidated, redundant, tired old thing. She wasn't the prettiest and still isn't the prettiest at the minute. On the Burgess, which for those who know Coventry, hasn't been the easiest of streets. I don't know whether I'm selling this to you yet, but it'll be fantastic. There's a hidden gem in there, and we see it as a real catalyst for change on that particular part of the city. It's a stone's throw from all the city's amenity, cathedral lanes and everything else we can all list. It's a stone's throw from all the employment opportunities, from the railway station, from the university, etc. So we think it's really well placed. But to your question, what's the pandemic done to our design, really, that perhaps we wouldn't have done otherwise? And I guess the two words I'd use, and I'm not sure we've used these exact words today, but we've certainly used the themes, is well-being and work. Well-being and work have connected into the way we live and the way we use our homes so much. So what we're doing on Sirius, which is the name of the development on Ironmonger Row, what we're doing at Sirius is trying to capture those two things and make apartment living still very attractive. Because I think one of the things the pandemic's done is made people question, do we want something other than an apartment where we've got some outdoor space, we don't have to sit at the kitchen to do our work, etc. So we are giving over space that would otherwise be saleable space or lettable space or whatever to a residents only office workspace. So actually you own an apartment, but you don't have to sit in those four walls to go and do your work. If you're working at home 1 day a week, 5 days a week, however often you're working at home, you can go to a fully kitted out workspace, a proper office that's in your own building. You don't even have to get wet if it's raining outside, and do your work. We provide all the Wi-Fi and all the other infrastructure that Martin's referenced earlier today, so that people can actually have a proper work-life balance. They're not just sitting in the same four walls all day long. And we think that connects to well-being as well. You know, we've seen the effects on people not leaving the house. We've all seen it, haven't we? So we think that links to that. But there's a second part of well-being, and we saw it in the cooperative when we did the park, and that's external space. And that's one thing we're just trying to create into the Sirius development at the moment. And we've got terraces, we've got roof space and all the rest of it, so that people can actually enjoy the outdoor space when they're not in the very special office or the very special apartment they can own. And finally, the third point I'd make, and this is a lesson that, frankly, it's not learned from the pandemic, it's learned from everything that all of us on this video today have ever done, is people still want to be proud of where they live. You know, we're a home proud bunch, aren't we? So you want something cool, you want something that you can beat your chest about. So the architectural elements of Sirius are pretty special. It's all bronze clad, and we've got these fins that fly up into the sky and all the rest of it. So we think it's going to be a real landmark with a place where you can work and a place where you can keep your head straight in some wellbeing space. And I think the latter two are the ones the pandemic have changed, Carl.
He pulled it out of the bag, Carl, didn't he? He pulled it out of the bag.
Absolutely, right at the end.
Just email me if you want one of these. They're selling quickly.
Well done, Neil. And thank you very much for that. You talked about well-being, and I think from the research we've been undertaking, the feedback we've had recently after 12 to 15 months of the great work from home experiment, it doesn't feel to a lot of people anymore that they're working from home. It feels more like they're actually sleeping at the office. It's getting people into that mindset. So what you're talking about is actually something fairly radical and probably going to be very well thought of. But Richard, if we can turn to you, please. Rainier probably has more experience than any other residential developer in Coventry. Sorry, Neil. But with projects in Paradise Street providing 500 homes, Gulston Road 200 homes, and Binley Court going to provide about 60 homes. Can you give us an insight into what has attracted you to Coventry?
Yeah, thank you, Carl. I think we've touched on a lot of it already today, but from a personal perspective and from a residential developer perspective, the two fantastic universities in Coventry and Warwick was key. Great transport connections, 60 minutes into London. When we started delving deeper into the demographics, the average age of the city centre resident is 23. And then there's also the key employment base, such as JLR. And there's also softer elements as well, in terms of City of Culture was on the horizon when we started to invest into Coventry, and we felt that was very exciting. But then even softer still, elements like Wasps relocating to play at the Rico, I felt was a real coup for Coventry. It put Coventry on a different kind of radar. And then when we started engaging the city on our first schemes, we got the impression, and we felt very strongly, that Coventry as a council was open for business, and there was strong leadership, and they had a vision, and they were welcoming of what we wanted to do. So there was the initial interest from ourselves, but then when we started talking to the council, it's very refreshing that you're kind of being welcomed in with open arms, whereas in other regions where we invest and develop, you sometimes feel like you're butting up against a brick wall, even though you maybe have a visionary approach to what you're trying to do. And I think for us as a residential developer, it wasn't, you saw the amount of institutional investment that was happening in the purpose-built student market. In Goldman Sachs, as an example, have invested into Coventry City Centre in a purpose-built student scheme. And we're pro-student, and there's definitely a role for it. But it wasn't until Neil delivered the cooperative that you had your first kind of post-financial crash, high-quality residential development. And I think something that Monica and Martin was talking about, I think we can go some way in helping join the dots, because with these two fantastic universities, the city is producing an incredible amount of talent. There's fantastic student accommodation for them to live in. Where do they go to when they graduate? Where do they go and live, and where do they go and work? Because they don't want to necessarily move straight into the suburbs. And so we can help in kind of providing that step for the mid to late 20s going into the early 30s on retaining them in the city centre. And that's got to be good for Coventry and the wider region.
Thank you very much, Richard. That's really helpful. Can I just remind those listening in, Q&A, if you use the Q&A button, we'll be picking up questions. We do have the first of these that's been fed through to us, and this is to the panel as a whole. So I'll probably ask Martin to start talking about this first, because you did talk earlier about social infrastructure. But the question is, how are the panel from their various standpoints engaging with the community to ensure involvement and inclusivity?
Yeah, I think, Carl, good question. One of the advantages, if that's the right phrase, from winning UK City of Culture back in 2017 now, is that it was absolutely incumbent on us to think much more about, through the lens of culture, but it could have been another lens, just where people are at. So I could answer that question really blandly and go, well, for big schemes, for big, technical consultations, for impact, yeah, we do what everyone else does. And actually, we use probably digital channels better than most. But actually, that's not really the answer to the question. What we've done, I think, is go to where people are at. And I think we're still only halfway where we need to be. Because actually, you can't understand people's view about their own city. And of course, people in Coventry, and Monica will say this from a Warwickshire point of view, there's no such thing as one Coventry as a city. There are 1,000 different views. As Neil said, the pride of your home is then matched often by the pride of quite a small area around you. When we always survey people, their notion of place is often quite limited geographically to like the little park really close to them, or even maybe 10 other units around them. So what we've tried to do is understand how people are kind of defining their own places and their own spaces. And I'm not for one moment saying we've got it right, but we're doing it more creatively than most other cities because we've got the 2021 opportunities. So through the programming, through the reimagination again of the cultural strategy for the future, the independent arts and culture sector, what it's doing, even the bloody broadcastability of our city is now making people feel proud, but also making them feel quite demanding and activists actually about change. because you're seeing stuff now. It's the guilty knowledge I've always talked about is now on multimedia global platforms. The great things that are in our place, but also the things that need to be rewired and reconnected better. So all of that suggests to me is that we're doing it pretty well. I think we need to work harder, not just thinking through people's eyes about what that future looks like, but probably selling the overall jigsaw puzzle better. I'll put my hands up. I take full responsibility for that. Sometimes we expect people to fill all the pieces in themselves, because it's people like us on this call that are paid to think about it that kind of know, well, there's a reason why we're going to do this with Friday. But we almost need to stand back and give people the whole mosaic, the whole jigsaw, because they're brilliant when they understand that. And particularly they will bear with us more when they understand things don't happen overnight. And when we're digging things up, when we're hoarding things around, they'll understand hopefully a bit more that it's part of a bigger play. So I think we probably need to work a bit hard on that to make it more inclusive, if I'm honest.
Thank you very much, Martin. The next question, I'm going to probably ask Sarah to start answering this one. But in terms of economic growth, how important is student retention? And is there evidence of improvement of this within the area?
So this is one of the things actually that I started looking at when I was chair of the Digital Creative Business Group for the Local Enterprise Partnership, because we were losing graduates from both universities in the very skills that we needed for our digital sectors. And so one of my things was about kind of how do we showcase the opportunities. So I think graduates are going to want to go other places. It's very interesting that we're working on a top 50 Coventry and Warwickshire campaigns. If anyone's got any people they want to nominate for our top 50, please do get in touch. But actually, our digital and marketing apprentice at the LEP has been talking to alumni across the world that have come through Coventry and Warwickshire, and we want that global presence. We want our graduates to be going and getting the best jobs for them. But equally, if they don't know what opportunities are right on their doorstep, then I do feel like we failed in that respect. So as I said, we started a campaign engaging with both universities, but just making them aware of the digital opportunities, because it was very much a drain to London for fintech, and not realising that actually we've got our Silicon Spa Games cluster, we've got serious games, we've got digital platform builders, we've got a whole range of businesses here that are, I guess, more creative in certain ways that they can get involved in. Have we done any? I haven't seen the stats to show whether that's significantly improved things, but certainly I know anecdotally there's a lot more kind of recruitment drives happening, particularly with games actually from our local universities. They used to go particularly to Sheffield and Nottingham and other areas, and now they've set up good relationships with the student careers teams, so that they're presenting at careers fairs, and they're just raising that awareness. So certainly from a relationship building point of view, that has improved. Thank you, Sarah. Monica?
Yeah, I just want to join up some of Neil's comments with Sarah's and this question, Carl, because I think we all know that when students have a positive experience at a particular university, many of them want to stay in that area. So, if they've had a good time in Bath or Bristol, they want to work in that area. And Neil was talking about people wanting to be proud of their homes, but also balance well-being. And, one of the bright spots to come out of the pandemic in the past couple of years is that people are giving a lot more consideration to their well-being and to the environment that they live in, and they're reprioritizing the things that are important to them in terms of their daily lives. And I think it's the same for students. They do want a lucrative career, they want a progressive career, but they also want to have that career in an area in which they enjoy living. And we've had some success lately in Coventry and Warwickshire with our universities in being able to match those skills that they come out with and their talents with the career opportunities that are on offer locally. But where we need to work in partnership across, the development sector and local authorities and education is about bundling together the opportunities with the environment and the living in Coventry and Warwickshire offer that we give to young people and those whom we're trying to attract with skills. So, never more has that partnership been more important. It's not simply about bricks and mortar, it's about social value, it's about future economic prosperity and making this place an attractive place to live and work, which, was what we're all after.
Thank you, Monica. And that brings us on to, quite neatly, the next question that's come in from the audience. So, Neil, if I can push this one towards you, please, but what's the extent of the housing challenge in the area? Where does quality and truly affordable housing sit on the agenda?
Thanks, Carl. So if I answer the question about the housing challenge, not from a political lens, but from an actual practical lens on the ground, I think the housing challenge within the city centre itself, and I'm not talking about the suburbs that surround Coventry where there's some amazing houses, I'm talking about in the city centre, is being very blunt. Before the cooperative, the capital value that had been proven in the city wasn't massive, and therefore it was really difficult to attract developers to come and build residential schemes in the city. I'm talking city centre apartment schemes, because actually they couldn't back it up with capital value. That's now been proven, not by the yes, by the cooperative, but actually by other schemes since. So actually the developments are, as we know, already happening around us now. In terms of affordable housing and where that sits on the agenda, that's a really good point, because I'll go back to Sirius, if I may, and talk about the Ironmonger Row scheme, because the cooperative was all about very luxurious units overlooking the park, etc., that I've told you about and we talked today about. Sirius is something completely different, and it's actually working on a London model that's been done before called pocket living, and it's where units are created that are, micro, if I use that word. They're smaller. They're not small, but they're smaller. And the reason they're smaller is because then you can keep them affordable. And that's the exact concept of Sirius, a really cool place to live with your own office in a building that's affordable. So to put that in context, yes, we've got some amazing duplexes on the top that are quite a lot more money, but our smaller apartments start at just over £100,000. Same spec as the ones on the top, same everything else. You still get access to the office and everything else. But those graduates, those other people that we've spoken about today who want a really cool address in a really cool city, because it is cool now, isn't it? We all want to get sent to Coventry. Then they can afford to live there. Price is not the barrier for them. They can actually afford to live there. And I hope it kind of works well, and I hope other developers pick up on it. And I'm not talking about affordability from a political sense. Martin and others can talk about that. I'm talking about a true on-the-ground practical sense. Can Joe Bloggs on the street afford to live in this cool place they want to live in? And that's what we've been working hard on Sirius. So I'm glad you put that one to me, Carl.
Thank you very much, Neil. Well answered. And the next question I'm going to throw over to Martin Reeves, because I think it's right up his street. But what's the extent of the challenge in terms of upskilling the workforce? And I think this is where Coventry, in recent years, is absolutely right. And how is this influencing education and opportunities for community?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. And we touched on some of it. This is being recorded, so I'll be a little bit more measured than I normally would. This is absolutely all the way from early years all the way through. So this idea that we just focus on reskilling now, we need to think as a country so much more about curriculum and about what we're gearing up and tooling up our youngsters for the future. And the reason I say that, as well as the fact that those of the younger generation that, by the way, we know, so we shouldn't be surprised that every global recession, economic setback and shock creates a disproportionate effect on younger people. We also know it has a disproportionate effect in Coventry because of our employment structure of the 50-55 pluses. So I'm not saying for one moment there's not a need for a really coherent plan, and we are on it, but we are fooling ourselves if we think that that is going to be just the answer. We've got now youngsters coming through the preschool system, schools that need to be given the kind of tools for life, the language skills, which are very different from the current curriculum, quite frankly, and being able to understand, as Monica and others have said, just to debug myths. It doesn't matter what gender you are, what ethnicity you are. It shouldn't matter which postcode you're born into in Coventry. You can be anything and anyone you want to be. And if you might say, well, that's complete pie in the sky, it's not, because what we know is there are jobs structurally in the next 5, 10, 15 years in Coventry and Warwickshire. We don't even know what they look like yet. But what we do know is there's certain skills, certain flexibility, durability is going to be required. The notion of digital, the notion of being, as I said on the chat, the green-centered, and understanding that consuming resources is not going to be the way we can get on with this anymore. The consciousness about place, all these things are the things that we should be building in for our youngsters, because if we do that, along with offering, as we are, and I'm proud of the work that LEP and others have done, working with colleges and others, thinking about fundamentally different pathways. It was only a few years ago, and the challenge even of our own universities to not be too sniffy about alternative routes to degrees and the power of degree apprenticeships, the power of vocational routes through. So we do all of that. We do it at adult education level, but the early year stuff, Carl, and I really say this is not for education providers and for local authorities, schools, universities. This is as important for the commercial business interests that are on this call, because the pipeline of the future are going to be about people that have got a fundamentally different background perspective. That will create better business opportunities. Sarah's point about scaling up, we have a big problem in the UK where we have amazing ingenuity and startups, often stimulated by downturns, but our attrition is far too high. So where's the scale out? And this comes from amazing people that often do not go through traditional skills education routes. So not an easy job, Carl. I mean, I've spoken a million miles an hour as all do, but you've got to make a decision about whether this is kind of just certain people's responsibility. And I would argue everyone needs to challenge, for example, government on curriculum. I'm still amazed, right, that my two daughters are learning very early on in their schooling about handwriting. Last time I looked, I can't remember the last time I wrote anything down. Now, people can challenge me on that, but the point is we need to be innovative. We're lagging behind the very investment that you mentioned, Carl, earlier on, from parts of South Asia, from parts even of North America, Scandinavia. We are missing out on understanding culture because actually our education and our fit for the future of future workforces is not at the races.
Martin, don't get me talking about that. It's one of my favourite subjects, but the fact that, our curriculum looks now the same as it did 35, 40 years ago when I was at school is just totally wrong. But we've not yet talked about public-private partnerships. And having worked in the city over many, many years, I know that the approach is very mature within Coventry and within Warwickshire. And to some extent, it's almost taken for granted that sectors work together. But Richard, you've been involved in a number of things. And building up expectations is one thing, delivering on the promise is another. And what have you found to be the formula for success in sustaining the relationships and achieving really a win-win with your public sector partnerships?
I think it's very simple, Carl, in that you don't over-promise and under-deliver. I think as soon as you start doing that, you lose your reputation and you don't hold any validity when you're engaging with the local authorities. So if you take our Goulston Road scheme, for example, that's been delivered by NSG Developments, that's a prime student site. When we first start, it's on the edge of the technology park in Coventry and the campus. When we first started engaging the council, we promised that we wanted to deliver residential. Going back to my comments earlier, we felt there was a gap in the market for high quality city centre residential. When we achieved planning, working collaboratively with the council, we were inundated with subject to planning offers from student developers because we felt that, and the student developers felt like once we'd agreed the massing and the scale and the architecture, the battle was won, and it would be a relatively simple process to go back into planning and change it to students. Now, if we'd done that, that would have been incredibly short-term thinking on our part, because we'd been saying from day one we wanted it to be residential, and it's being built and it's residential. And I think that goes a long way to making sure that you hold validity with the local authorities. And I think it's the first time I've witnessed it in the past 2 to 3 years in the wider Midlands region, that you've got real joined up thinking between the local authority, the LEP, Homes England, the county councils and other stakeholders. And I think in the Midlands, I think it's a very refreshing approach in that everyone is pushing in the same direction.
Richard, thank you very much for that. We're coming to the end of the session now, but before I hand back over to Simon, can I thank all our panelists? That's absolutely great input, really, really interesting. Monica, we heard from you about the legacy of diverse and different opportunities that are arising from the city of Coventry. Yeah, the real power that's coming through the region on green propulsion systems, battery storage, creative, digital and automotive technologies. This is a convergence of technologies across the region, which we've seen in other industries across the UK and throughout the world. It's really important that those sectors start to work together as they are in the region. Martin, we've heard from you again about the importance of digital infrastructure and social infrastructure, something that's going to bind our communities together, and not just rebuilding or recovering, but those important words, resetting and reimagining. And that was echoed by Sarah, whose vision for scale up will be important. It's making Coventry and Warwickshire a highly attractive place to live, work and invest, and a more creative approach to funding to enable that scale up. And from the 2 residential developers, we've heard Neil, the pandemic has changed our lives in so many ways. And the way that we develop housing, the way that we use housing has to react to that. And from Richard, your comments really underscored the importance of the 2 fantastic universities that the area has and the demographics that come with that. But the culture and sport play an enormous part of fueling the benefits of the city and the region. And those are the things that really make the communities work. So on that note, Simon, can I hand back to you and once again, thank all of our panelists for their excellent input today.
Thank you.
I'm back up and live. Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you to Martin, thank you to Sarah, Neil, Richard, Monica, and obviously our fabulous chair today, Carl. When we first set out to create the session today, when we engaged with Carl and Martin, we really wanted the main attraction, obviously, was focusing on the region we've discussed today, but also was to create the energy around the area that was reflective in the great work that's been done. So thank you to everybody. I think we've achieved that in spades. It's been brilliant. I'm not going to pour through what's been discussed. There's been loads of fascinating information. Carl, I think, has done that wonderfully at the end there. But it's just a very quick special thank you to Carl for his introduction, his keynote, the Q&A, and obviously to Martin, fascinating, informative keynote. There's obviously been lots of creative thinking that's been going on in Coventry over the last decade. Although it's obviously not job done, and there's more creative thinking indeed that needs to be unfolded, and obviously from an investor perspective, which everyone's got the finger in the pie. The holding of a nerve, I thought, was an interesting point as well, and I think that will continue the success that the city has enjoyed over the last few years. I think it's going to be absolutely fascinating to watch that. And also, again, one of the recurring theme that resonated with me, it's not a bounce back that's needed. It's not a recovery, but it's a bounce back. And I think that's as a mindset, if you combine all of the above, I think that's a fairly handy equation to make sure the region is in safe hands and has a prosperous future. So thank you very much to that. Moving very quickly on to our next event, 6th of July, again with Alison Young and a team. City Focus is Birmingham, Building Back to Business. That's the 6th of July, and that's a slightly different time of 12:30. For those of you who are interested, commercially involved in build to rent, so Movers and Shakers are holding their, what I believe is the 7th annual build to rent conference. That is indeed next week. So that's the 29th and the 30th. So that's the Tuesday and the Wednesday of next week. And the theme is Build to Rent, Back to the Future, Sustainable Living, and it's a fully virtual event which will be screened live on our Build to Rent community platform and app. And indeed, today will be repositioned onto our YouTube channel. It will also be released onto various social media channels and LinkedIn and the like. So if you do see that and you think there's a colleague or a friend who may get value from today, please feel free to inform them of this session and the link, and please feel free, obviously, to forward it onto those individuals. Thank you all once again. Thank you to our sponsors, to Everson Young, and thank you to all of you for joining us. I do hope you found it of value. So from everyone at Movers and Shakers, have a great remainder of the week. Stay safe, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Many thanks. Cheerio. Bye-bye.